Good morning, Dan and Amy. We're coming to you live from Mueller Certified Public Accountants in Elgin, Illinois, part of our AM 560 Signature Bank Business Tour. And Amy, February 27th, obviously a special day.
That's the birth of William F Buckley Jr., right?
That's the...
the death.
Yes, correct. Obviously, it's very special to you. You remember it. Well, February 27th, 2008, we lost the father of modern conservatism, the founder of National Review, and one of the most congenial and dizzying intellects the 20th century produced, William F. Buckley. I actually had the chance to bring him to speak to Northwestern.
Ooh, when was that?
Mid-90s, 1995, 1996.
Because he's your hero.
He's one of the intellectual guide stars. There's no question. And this was great. Just classic Bill Buckley. So this was after, I think, Bill Clinton's first State of the Union address. And he said, after watching President Clinton's State of the Union address, I had to drop an ashtray on the ground to make sure gravity still existed. That's, the Bill Buckley.
Awesome.
That's not a great Bill Buckley impersonation, but it is a great Bill Buckley line, and he had a lot of them.
I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
Oh, that's spectacular.
That's another classic. And, of course, there's a good documentary, Best of Enemies, him and Gore Vidal providing color commentary during the 1968 convention, and just their kind of lifelong rivalry, to be polite about it. So much just so much that Bill Buckley contributed both politically as well as intellectually. One of the last of the true public intellectuals. And so we celebrate his memory, at least we conservatives do. And National Review, the magazine he founded, the organization he founded, which is still going strong today, of course, is doing a number of events around the country, sponsoring a number of events. And there's one in Chicago. There are different dates. I believe the one in Chicago is April 12th, but we'll get the specifics from our next guest. He is John O. Sullivan. He is a editor-at-large of National Review. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So the idea of having these events around the country to kind of remember and celebrate Bill Buckley's life and contributions, the impetus for that and how you see these events going.
Well, it's partly, of course, because it's important to keep the memory of Bill alive and keep it green, and to make plain that he still, what he had to say from 1955 when he started National Review until he died 10 years ago, to make clear that the lessons that he taught in those years are still valid, and they still are. And also that a certain kind of conservatism, which coexists with other kinds of conservatism, which he particularly minted, is still part of the major political scene. And I think that he is. If I listen to that quote, the marvelous quote about prefer to be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston Telephone Directory than the combined faculties of Harvard and Yale. Now, that has a somewhat Trumpian ring to it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
One of those, I suspect, experts prefer to put my trust in the long run on the common man. I think that is an element in Bill's thought which is much neglected. He's normally seen as aristocratic, but he was a kind of aristocratic populist.
Well, speaking of President Trump, what do you think William F. Buckley Jr. would think of President Trump?
Well, he would have thought a number of different things, wouldn't he? He would have been in favor of his strong patriotism. Remember that when he was a boy of about, I think, 12 or 13, Bill put up the Stars and Stripes on the wall of the dormitory in the English public school where he was sent. And he was persisted in talking to the other boys about how awful George III was. So there's that element in Bill, and there's no doubt about it. He said once time he wasn't really a nationalist, but he was using nationalism, I think, in a special term there. He was a very strong American patriot. He would have been less in favor, I think, obviously, of protectionism. He was always suspicious of that. The magazine always took a strong line against it. But on the other hand, he was also a realist, both politically and economically, and he would have seen that in a world of predatory powers like China, and we've just seen big news about China, reverting to a kind of cult of the personality, which means that one man will make all the decisions, really, about the future of China and the way it's going to behave in Asia and the way it's going to behave in its trade relations with the U.S. I think he would have seen the necessity for a very clear, strong line. Now, as I say, other points he wouldn't have been so happy.
Yeah, and he was, of course, for the bulk of his era, the central concern was the Soviet Union, and he, of course, was a strong anti-communist, a proponent of Whittaker Chambers and others who fought communists in this country, as well as, of course, the presidents like Reagan who confronted the evil empire straight away. And so, looking at Bill Buckley, thinking about the more pronounced threats of the day, Russia is still a threat, but Islamofascism, other rogue regimes like North Korea, that would have been central to what Bill Buckley was thinking about today and writing about today, I presume, as well.
Yes, they certainly would have been. And just to add to one of your points there, Bill would have been rousing people's concern which is not nearly as great as it should be, about the persecution of Christians in the Middle East mainly, but also around the world. Because Bill was always very conscious of the necessity for Christians and other believers, because he was a very tolerant man. One of his rules was that although National Review was seen as a Catholic magazine, it wasn't really. He made a rule that the religion editor of National Review should never be a Catholic. Was in fact at different times Protestant and a famous Jewish scholar. And so I think that the persecution of Christians would have loomed very large in his mind. And it's something which is where he would have been angry at the attitudes of a lot of people on Capitol Hill, but also at a lot of our allies in Europe who essentially, in order not to offend Middle Eastern countries and Islamic countries, try to push this to the side and to bury it under other concerns. That's something we should remember.
Just going back to the discussion of Trump for a minute, it seems to me that National Review has nicely kept Bill Buckley's approach as their guiding ethos in terms of the diversity of opinion within the conservative spectrum. I mean, you have some of the writers who I enjoy that are frankly never Trumpers, and others who kind of are with Trump when he is advancing a conservative policy position, and they're against him on things like protectionism or other instances where he's doing something less than advancing the conservative position on a particular policy issue. And it seems to me that diversity of opinion, where you've got deep intellects who are respectful of one another but spar intellectually, makes for a great outlet, and that's sort of what Buckley had in mind.
Well, of course, National Review had differing viewpoints, differing conservative viewpoints in it from day one. Bill actually liked to provoke debate and argument and indeed quarrels between some of the leading figures, like on the one hand James Burnham and on the other hand Wilbur Kendall. These were giants of conservative thought, and he very much enjoyed watching them fight and squabble. He was generally himself, as he himself said, a Burnhamite. He was very influenced by James Burnham. But I think the same thing is true now. Rich is the ringmaster of an extremely quarrelsome circus at times, but he manages to keep the show on the road. And I think that you've got on the one hand, as you mentioned, somebody like Victor David Hanson, the classical liberals, the classical scholar, and the man who's an expert on the techniques of war, who is very strongly for Trump. And on the other hand, you've got, say, Jay Nordlinger, whose latest book has been on the children of monsters like Stalin, but who is himself rather very critical of Donald Trump and of the Trump presidency. And between these two, you've got about 5 or 6 people I could name who are outstanding in what they write and in their field, but who debate these questions all the time. It's very much the same kind of magazine under Rich as it was under Bill, and as I hope it was under me in the 10 years which I edited it. Yeah. I always felt that we were the forum, we were the arena in which conservatives debated all the big issues, and that meant we had to have a big welcome sign to all conservatives on our front door.
So a couple of years ago, I